I was driving on the vacant highway, battling to keep my eyes open. It was clearly beyond 2 a.m. What's more, I couldn't resist the opportunity to take a gander at the GPS like clockwork, trusting the assessed appearance time would some way or another go down quicker. I'd been out and about for a perilous 12 hours in a row, just halting for food and gas while heading to my new home. I'd been compelled to move for work, yet entertainingly sufficient. It was work that never allowed me to go on an outing to see the spot I'd be moving to at last. However, I came to the expressway exit and into the town I'd be residing in. It was dull, so it was precisely difficult to see what everything resembled, except I could see to the point of telling it wasn't quite as great as where ID resided before. The majority of the structures seemed to be privately possessed, and run shops that were a long way from what I was utilized to. Alongside that, a large portion of the lights were off when I got to my area. However, it wasn't all that terrible. The houses were customary, separated near one another. I pulled up to my home and left out and about, then got out to see the spot I'd call home for the following year. From the external, it seemed to be all the others. Yet what truly made a difference was within. I strolled up the carport and took out the key. I'd been sent a couple of days prior, placing it in the lock and turning it, yet there was no snap. I snatched the handle and pushed on the entryway, watching it float open. It was at that point opened. I immediately went in and hoped to ensure that my things were there, as movers had dropped everything off in the first part of the day. After a brief glance, nothing appeared to be missing. I realized almost certainly the movers had recently neglected to secure the spot, yet it actually gave me an awful inclination on top of all that. However, the lights and power didn't work. I realized I needed to set it up in the neighborhood, and it was clearly past the point of no return, as of now, to do it this evening. Yet I didn't figure they would just trim the power. I turned my telephone light on and began glancing through the rooms. The first floor was okay, standard looking, yet with a marginally more established kind of feel to it. I advanced up to the second floor. At the highest point of the steps was a long foyer with 5 entryways. I ventured into every one of the rooms, individually focusing my telephone light around. They were all tiny, and a ton of them had water harm on the roof and walls. Yet, when I made the way for the main room, I was shocked to see a solitary canvas laying on the floor. It looked grimy, like perhaps something the movers had used to wrap furniture with. Yet what made it so odd was that there was nothing by any means higher up beside that covering. All the furnishings and boxes were ground floor. I made a stride back and shut the entryway. I was at that point so worn out, I simply maintained that this night should be done with. I truly didn't have any desire to swarm my psyche with the vulnerabilities of moving here. I returned ground floor and sat on one of the couch seats that was as yet enveloped with plastic and rested my eyes. My eyes shocked open as an unexpected crash reverberated all through the house from above me. Genuinely, I couldn't actually say whether I'd nodded off or not. All I recollect was plunking down and shutting my eyes. The sound was cruel. However, in addition to some little bang, I stood up and went to the lower part of the Saint steps, gazing toward the dim lobby. The house was currently quiet. I probably remained there briefly prior to taking my telephone out and turning on the electric lamp. Then, at that point, gradually strolling up the creaky steps when I got to the highest point of the means and focused the light down the passage. I promptly saw the entryway at the far end was marginally open, and the undeniable layout of a figure was remaining between the break in the entryway. Taking a gander at me, I nearly fell in reverse down the means, as my nearby response was to turn and run. I ran for the front entryway and straight out into the carport and into my vehicle. I contemplated heading out, yet knowing, in a real sense, my things were all inside that house. I needed to ensure whoever was in there didn't make it out with anything. I called 911 and hung tight for their appearance out and about during the entire 10 minutes. I never saw any development in the windows or anybody leave through the front when the police looked through the house. However, the indirect access was completely open. It was clear to them that whoever that was had been residing inside the house, presumably since it had been empty over the course of the 2 or 3 months. At first, I thought they were discussing the loft, since I'd glanced through every one of the rooms and saw only a covering. Yet there was no loft. They were discussing the main room, which implied that when I was checking out higher up that evening, and I made the way for that room, all things considered, the individual was concealing along the wall, most likely right behind the entryway, and assuming that I had gone further inside the space to research the canvas and check out quite possibly as I could not have possibly made it. I'm 25 years of age, and this year I chose a house I'd been residing with my flatmates for the past very nearly 6 years, and disconnection is something I esteem. So at long last, purchasing a permanent spot for myself was an enormous accomplishment. It was in an adjoining town around 3 hours out from where I used to experience. This town was a lot more modest in scale and had way less structures. This shouldn't imply that each house was on a ranch or everything, except the areas were certainly not brimming with near one another lines of houses. They were fanned out, isolated by fields of trees and grass. The home I purchased was no exemption, being unobtrusive and among the more affordable side of the real estate market. It was out in the woods, a couple of miles from the market community. In the town on the day I moved in, I actually hadn't met anybody in the space, not the neighbors, or for the town's kin, and with the house being such a long ways out, with trees obstructing the encompassing perspectives, it truly felt like I was moving out into the center of no place, totally alone, saying it. Like that makes it sound more shocking than it truly felt. Yet, it wasn't exactly consoling of an idea. It is possible that I had a rental van for the afternoon, so I moved to work immediately, emptying my things into the house to be basically as speedy as conceivable. I attempted to put essentially everything squarely in the family room, as opposed to arranging it as I go. This required a couple of hours, and the sun was descending similarly as I was wrapping up. I put down a couple of boxes in the house and began leaving to the carport for the last 2 or 3 boxes, yet was surprised by a man remaining on my patio, nearly hindering the entire front entryway. He frightened me, taking me leap a bit prior to showing slight humiliation, and asking what he was hanging around for. The man, looking around 60 or so, grinned and presented himself as my new neighbor. I said it was ideal to meet him and made a short grin, yet couldn't actually help yet think about how I never saw him strolling up the carport to my home. As a matter of fact, I had no clue about where he came from, given it was simply woodland around my home. The man remained there, only sort of taking a gander at me briefly, then turned and strolled off my yard. I stood and just absorbed the bizarreness of the experience after a second. However, I ventured back outside and immediately got the other boxes into the house. I looked at the windows to ensure the man was gone and I didn't see him anyplace. So following brief, I went out and got in the van, driving it down the long soil carport. It had just been a couple of moments since the man had left. At this point, I didn't see him strolling as I drove down to the principal street. There could have been no different ways that I knew about, so this made me a smidgen more uncomfortable at any rate. I returned the van and got a neighborhood taxi back home then. At that point, began on unloading. I wasn't working quick since I was at that point tired and it was late. Yet I needed to get a portion of the furniture set up prior to tapping out. I snatched the parts of my bed casing and carried them into my room, starting to sort it out, before an unexpected thump hindered me. I halted and listened, sort of shaken by it. I got up and discreetly approached the front entryway. I kept the entryway shut and locked, yet glanced out the peephole and saw a similar man from during the day. Yet this time something was wrong with him, more so than before. His body was unstable, with his head moving around in an uncanny way, yet his eyes were fixed on the door handle. He was gazing at it seriously, standing near the entryway, as though standing by enthusiastically for me to open it. "Hello, it's your neighbor. Might you, at any point, open the entryway?" He hollered and afterward thumped again. I actually stayed on the opposite side, glancing through the peephole. His face started to show disappointment and outrage, and he beat on the entryway once again. He then turned and confronted the completely dark timberland. Watching out into the dimness, he held his hand up and did some kind of waving movement, followed by him running out into the timberland toward the path he waved at. Panicked, I promptly called the police, yet it was past the point of no return for them to be found and addressed after that evening. However, I, at absolutely no point, ever saw the man in the future, even right up till now. I currently have met my neighbors, and obviously not a single one of them were that man, and no one around appears to remember him from my portrayals. I don't have any idea who the man was motioning toward in the woods, or even the number of individuals that might have been out there trusting that the man will acquire my trust and inspire me to open the entryway. What might have happened subsequently, I accept, is best left unthought. This happened to me a long time back when I'd moved into a little home. It was just a mile from where I was residing previously, so it was anything but an extremely new spot by any means. Anyway, it was in favor of town that I didn't exactly go to frequently because of it having a record of violations and, simply generally speaking, a terrible standing. At the time, I wasn't in a decent monetary spot, so I needed to go with the less expensive spots, which turned out to be in that space. The day I moved in, I didn't talk or truly even see anybody. I just moved my stuff from the U-take into my new residence. On the second day, I began the unloading system by moving the containers and furniture into the rooms that they bell in. Once I got to moving my office furniture, however, I saw something through the window that grabbed my eye. There was a man, youthful, like 30 years of age, remaining in my carport. I looked as he just took a gander at the house and strolled into the yard. Investigating my windows from a remote place getting awkward, I left the window and went down the stairs to face him. Yet when I opened the entryway and looked external, he was at that point gone, not in my yard or carport or even on any of the walkways. He just totally left. I stood by to check whether he'd return. However, at that point, disregarded it and returned to what I was doing. Definitely, it was strange, yet I didn't have any idea what precisely I should do about it. I got my office set up, then went out to get some lunch prior to returning to deal with the room by 10 p.m. I was really worn out. I saved on with it, however long I could. Yet once 11 moved around, I was only finished for the night. The house was as yet a wreck, yet I left it. As is, switching out every one of the lights and getting in bed. It just required a couple of moments for me to nod off when I awakened. I turned my head over and took a gander at the clock I had laying on the floor, 2 a.m. I turned back, finished, and shut my eyes. Yet a suppressed sound awakened me. Right back, I lifted my head and listened again. Hearing a weak sound from ground floor, it was like something being hauled across the floor. Still in dismay, I sat up and listened much more eagerly. A couple of moments later, a comparable sound returned. Again, I remained from my bed and strolled over to the room entryway, opening it and peering down the corridor as I tuned in. Yet when I opened the entryway, every one of the sounds halted. I strolled into the lobby and over to the flight of stairs. I went down a couple of steps and investigated the railing, yet I saw nothing, and the house was still totally calm. When I got to the keep going step, I flicked on the light. At first, everything looked okay, nothing absent, and no one in the house. However, at that point, I saw something truly bizarre. The furnishings and boxes that were all against the walls had been driven away, and behind them there were a few cut-out segments in the wall. I felt blood surged from my face as I understood that somebody needed to have broken into my home and may try and still be inside. I approached my room and called for help. Yet the house stayed calm the entire time. I held up's really disrupting that. The police couldn't sort out how the gatecrasher gotten inside or back outside, nor did they sort out why the individual broke in. The main thought is that it appears as though they were searching for something in the walls. I don't have the foggiest idea what yet. There was nothing else to go off of. I recall that man I saw remaining external my home, contemplating whether he was the one to have broken in, yet even 2 years after the fact, nothing else is realized about what happened that night.